HighBridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents 1939, A People's History of the Coming of the Second World War by Frederick Taylor, read by Chris Macdonnell. Introduction. All the systems evolved by human beings for living on this earth were now shown to be either desultory, destructive, sadly outdated, or at risk. Booker Prize-winning British author Penelope Fitzgerald recalls her thoughts as a 22-year-old at Christmas time 1938. I tremble for my happiness, the future of my fatherland, for life, freedom, health and work. I am fearful of all those things in these minutes. Erich Ebermeyer, successful Nazi-era scriptwriter and playwright, confesses his true thoughts to his diary during the final moments of 1938. In the crucial year between the autumn of 1938 and the autumn of 1939, the nations of Europe slid from the promise of peace into the horror of total war. When this happened, there was no mass outbreak of enthusiasm for the war as there had been a quarter of a century earlier in 1914. Moreover, Hitler had hoped initially to limit the conflict, so perhaps even he did not want the war that he got. There is, of course, another issue here. While few in Britain or Germany wanted a war, it is a historical fact that the mass of the people in both countries eventually tolerated one, and participated, if not with enthusiasm, then with a grim determination. This is especially true of the journey undertaken by the mass of the public in Germany, which had been deeply reluctant to go to war in September 1938 over the Sudetenland, but a little less than a year later allowed itself to be persuaded that conflict with Poland was legitimate and necessary. The propaganda campaign undertaken by the Nazi regime to this end provides a near-perfect example of how, when a government exercises total control of information, an entire nation can be bent to its will. How did all this happen? The broad diplomatic and political events of 1938-9 and the roles of the elites involved have been described and analyzed many times since. But what did it feel like as an ordinary person in Britain or Germany to be living through this time of tension, fear, uncertainty, and ultimately catastrophe? What was occurring day by day far away from the diplomatic drawing rooms and the conferences and the cabinet meetings? To gain a deeper insight into this underreported aspect was my main motivation for researching and writing this book. In my research on the bombing of Dresden, the building of the Berlin Wall, the air raid on Coventry, books dealing with crises in human affairs, I have tried to take a fresh, ground-up view of such great and terrible events. Yet in building up a vivid, humanly graspable picture of lives that were lived over that fateful year, I have had to hunt more avidly and more widely than ever for sources that enable such an approach to the past. Historians working now, 80 years after the events described, are acting at the limit of human memory. When I first began to write this kind of history, almost 20 years ago, people who as adults had taken part in or been eyewitnesses to the Second World War were relatively plentiful. Now most surviving eyewitnesses were children at the time I am writing about. This fact affects the lens through which their memories are viewed. I did indeed interview a substantial number of people in their 90s in Britain and in Germany, the oldest of whom was 96. There was nothing wrong with their ability to remember or to describe what they recalled, but the memories were those of children, unaware of or protected from the greater, more frightening events occurring outside the home. All were fascinating and often delightful partners for conversation, but in most cases their views were limited. In particular, one of the things that I instinctively suspected but found clearly confirmed by these encounters was that peace, however desirable, is altogether less memorable than war. It is monaural rather than stereo, black and white rather than color, at least as far as ease of recollection is concerned. A child does not remember the news of the Munich conference, but children recall the experience of a bombing raid. There are, of course, dramatic exceptions to this rule, as listeners will hear from this book, and those exceptions justify all the extra effort. Fortunately, there turned out to be no shortage of other sources that bear witness to the everyday experiences of life just before the Second World War. In Britain, there is the Mass Observation Archive, with its precious diary material supplied by hundreds of ordinary civilians of differing ages and classes, some of it directly related to the great crises of the day, much of it not, but yet equally valuable and informative for this book's purposes. There is a host of diaries, memoirs, and newspapers, particularly popular newspapers such as the Daily Mirror and the Daily Express, that all provide lively and often surprisingly unmediated insights into the everyday lives, fears, hopes, and prejudices of the British population during the year covered by this book. The press also contains fascinating and quirky, sometimes unsettling, detail that has been lost in the great sweep of historical narrative, but proves, if one is prepared to put in the necessary hours of searching newspapers' inside pages, recoverable. There is also the astonishing trove of audio interview recordings available at the Imperial War Museum, London, and online, much of it taped 20 or 30 or more years ago, and there is a mass of published diaries and memoirs. In Germany, there was no equivalent of mass observation, unless one is allowed to count the apparatus of the Nazi police state, which reported on citizens' opinions, complaints, and fears, as well as goings-on in the Reich's small towns and great cities alike, and was often surprisingly willing to admit the uncomfortable aspects of these goings-on. The SS Security Service, the Gestapo, and the local party organizations all collected reports on public opinion. I have dipped into some direct archive material and also drawn on published collections of such documents. The German press at the time, although of course thoroughly controlled by the regime, also reveals a surprising amount, sometimes inadvertently, about the anxieties that preoccupied both the average citizen of the Third Reich and the men, I can safely say that because Nazi rule was exclusively male, who dictated what their fellow Germans heard and read and were expected to think. A month's issues of a German newspaper from the Baltic coast city of Stettin, for example, centering on the horrors of the November 1938 anti-Jewish pogrom that is familiar even to English-speaking readers by its German name Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass, shows more intensely and terrifyingly, because it is so localized and specific, how such events affect a seemingly average workaday place, one moreover that is scarcely mentioned in most history books of the time. It is all too clear that the destruction of Stettin's synagogue, first by fire and then by dynamite, occurred while the city's life went on around it, with its bustling restaurants, shops, bars and nightclubs, its theaters and newly built cinema complexes, chillingly similar to their 21st century equivalents. I also gained access to diaries and memoirs from the period which are held by the remarkable Deutsches Tagebucharchiv, German Diary Archive, in Emmendingen, near Freiburg in southwest Germany. Most of these are evidence of the extent to which, no matter how much they desired peace, ordinary people accepted and lived with, in some cases passionately embraced, the Nazi regime and its everyday demands. Other published diaries and memoirs, especially those of Ruth Andreas Friedrich and Erich Ebermeier, also provide precious insights into the private worlds that somehow survived within a monolithic totalitarian structure. I have, I think, ended up writing a different book from the one I would have conceived even just a few years ago. Before the disastrous economic and political events of 2008-9, it was possible to blithely assume that we had left the brutal and unpredictable world of the 1930s behind us. However, Just as the economic crisis of 1929 to 31 summoned up the demons described in this book, so our own time's economic and social problems, excessive national and private debt, globalization leading to unemployment and low wages for the majority but high profits for the few, and uncontrolled mass movements of populations have led to similarly destabilizing and demoralizing developments in Europe, America, and parts of Asia. At the same time, large-scale abuse of data, accompanied by manipulation of online information and social media, has placed persuasive power into the hands of 21st century authoritarian disruptors, to an extent that their predecessors in the 1930s could only have dreamt of. The rebellion against membership of the European Union, culminating in the British Brexit referendum on the 23rd of June 2016, represents a new high watermark for anxious and distrustful popular sentiment. A little more than 70 years after the war against extreme nationalism appeared won, a small but clear majority of those who chose to vote essentially reaffirmed the near-absolute primacy of nationalism over internationalism, reversing the political direction in which the United Kingdom and the rest of Europe had appeared to be travelling since 1945. In the United States, a phrase with dubious historical pedigree, "America first," has become current once more. What we are living through is not, of course, precisely a repeat of the 1930s. However, the study of the 1930s reminds us of the dangers of crass inequality, of international beggar-my-neighbor competition, of the capacity of marginalized social groups for extreme violence based on the scapegoating of minorities, and of the many other consequences that flow from irresponsible and often sadly misjudged notions of national self-interest. As for us, the ordinary people of today, like our grandparents and great-grandparents in the late 1930s, we are sure that we want all the advantages of prosperity, safety, a roof over our heads, and the conveniences of fast travel and communication. And, like them, we want the gift of international peace, which guarantees all these good things. However, many of us also seem to think we can combine these benefits with crude national self-aggrandizement, while remaining immune to the consequences. No one really expects another war in Europe. However, it is also true that for the first time in almost 3/4 of a century, no one really rules it out. In this trend lies the chilling similarity between our world and the experience of the people living day by day, week by week, through the chaotic and unpredictable time immediately preceding the outbreak of the Second World War. This is how it felt to be human beings existing in the thick of a fateful and ultimately catastrophic phase in European history, their experience unmediated by hindsight. Like most of us today, our grandparents and great-grandparents were largely preoccupied with private daily duties and routines, preoccupations and gratifications. They could not, of course, foresee the future. Wider dangers remained unseen or half-seen. Individual and communal hopes for peace and continuing prosperity had not yet been dashed. Britain was quite modern, if the term makes sense, by the end of the 1930s. Germany, it should be said, was also a typical Western consumer society in many, often quite disarming ways. However, with the active encouragement of the Nazi governing apparatus, the country was also a pressure cooker of passions. A regime such as Hitler's, which follows a major peaceful diplomatic victory, the Munich Agreement, in short order with a state-sponsored savage and murderous attack on a law-abiding section of its own population, the Kristallnacht outrages against Germany's Jews, is not one whose leader's actions on the international stage can be viewed in a value-free way as pragmatic. There is, it seems to me, something much more powerful and compulsive at work here in the German national psyche at that time. Turmoil within, that eventually became reflected in turmoil without. Piecing together a mosaic of public and private feeling and judging its often hidden power seems to me a way of redressing the imbalances of a top-down view that can end up looking at major political actors' machinations in a kind of arid, almost laboratory isolation. Perhaps some similar history will be written years from now about present-day Britain and America, especially the latter, in this fascinating and unnerving context. Most books about the pre-war era that try to balance a top-down narrative with a bottom-up element tend to confine themselves to sketching what ordinary people are doing when they are fearing the imminence of a war that, with hindsight, we know lies just over the horizon. 1939 will establish what they were doing when the threat of war was not presently on their minds. Working, spending time with family, worrying about money or their personal appearance, eating and going dancing or to the cinema, so allowing us to enter fully their world of 8 decades ago. The closing weeks of 1938 appeared to draw a line under the post-war era, satisfying most of Germany's grievances about the injustices of the Treaty of Versailles, securing more just and potentially more stable borders for the states of Central Europe. There were high hopes of permanent peace. The problem and ultimate tragic causality lay, as we know now, but millions alive at the time did not, in the sinister nature of Hitler's true ambition. Austria, having lost its centuries-old empire, had tried to join with newly democratic Germany in 1918, but been prevented by the victors from doing so. In 1931, the small and impoverished republic tried again, this time in the form of a customs union with its big brother to the north. Again, the great powers blocked this in many ways sensible move, for political reasons. Even in the case of the Sudetenland, the German-speaking districts of Bohemia and Moravia, which had also tried to join Germany in 1918, there was a cultural logic to their incorporation into a single German-speaking state in October 1938. The German public, even those portions of it still unsympathetic to Nazism, approved. So, more unexpectedly, did the populace in Britain, France, and other democratic countries. Opinions had changed since 1918. Their governments had denied these concessions to the most benign democratic politicians of Weimar Germany right through the 1920s, but now, belatedly, had come to view the post-war settlement as unjust and unsustainable. The recipient of their resulting largesse was not, however, a rational statesman. It was too late for that, but an insatiable dictator. The ruling elites in Britain and France failed to realize in time that they were not dealing with a slightly more excitable version of Weimar's Gustav Stresemann or Heinrich Brüning. Hitler was a new phenomenon, an ideologically driven leader who sought not reasonable national satisfaction but absolute power. How did so many people miss seeing this catastrophe in the making until it was almost too late? Professional property and industrial developers use, when they can get away with it, a clever but none too moral method of gaining permission from the planning authorities for dubious projects. This entails applying for, and being granted, a succession of minor, apparently reasonable, and not necessarily dangerous-looking permissions until, in effect, these accumulate into a permitted project that would not have been allowed had the authorities been presented with the overall plan from the start. This is known in the business as salami slicing. With hindsight, we can see that Hitler was adept at the salami-slicing technique in his relations with the British, French, Czechoslovaks, Poles, and other interested parties during the later 1930s. By 1939, showing his characteristic mixture of boldness and guile, the Führer had accumulated what he needed in territory, diplomatic clout, and military strength in order to dominate Europe, not to mention potentially the Eurasian lands to the east. During this same year, the democratic powers began to realize the true extent of his aims. Of course, by then it was far too late to thwart him without resorting to massive force. Following on from this, the populations of the European nations, soon to be joined by the Americans and Russians, were drawn into a vast and bloody worldwide war of extermination that just 3 or 4 years earlier no one had imagined could ever happen. The price ultimately paid on both sides was a terrible one, in blood, in senseless destruction, and in the nightmare that was the Holocaust. On a material, perhaps less essential level, it also delayed what might be called the modern project. Had war not intervened, shattering so much peaceful promise, Europe might not only have been spared immeasurable horror, but would also have been able to enjoy the harmless pleasures and securities of prosperous consumerism in the 1940s, rather than having to wait until the 1950s and 1960s. That thwarted promise of a better material life also forms part of this book's theme. During the fateful first days of September 1939, most adult Europeans were, of course, aware of the appalling cost of the previous war. Many millions dead, the collapse of historic nations, destruction, hunger, revolution. Few, apart from a minority of fanatics, wanted another conflict of that type. The 2 decades that had elapsed since the Great War ended had seen hyperinflation, disorder, and economic depression, a roller coaster ride of social and political instability. As the world approached the mid-1930s, however, the international economic climate had improved. Despite continuing poverty and unemployment in some parts of Europe, a phenomenon that we would see as recognizably modern had begun to emerge: a mass consumer society. Before 1914, just about all of what could be called luxury had been confined to the topmost segment of society. In 1939, the spread, while still relatively limited, was far greater. More people shared in the comfort and convenience of material things than ever before, in a way that caused changes in how society functioned and in its members' expectations. By 1938, the level of consumption had risen in all the advanced countries of Europe. There was radio in millions of households, there were telephones, there were fairly sophisticated electrical appliances for the home, there was commercial air travel as well as the established rail network. Private car ownership, though still much rarer than in America, was no longer the preserve of the rich and privileged. There was even television, which came first to Germany in 1935, in good part for the very modern reason that the Olympic Games were due to take place the next year in Berlin. Britain followed in 1936, with better quality pictures. In peacetime, Nazi Germany, for all its cruelties and intolerance, was not Soviet Russia. American and other foreign films were shown throughout Germany, unless the directors or stars were well known to be Jewish. Foreign newspapers were on sale in German cities, so long as they were not clearly socialist or communist. Newspapers carried the schedules of foreign radio stations as well as German ones, a situation that would change radically once war was declared, after which listening to non-German transmissions became a serious, potentially capital offense. The facade of relative normality and prosperity that the country presented to the casual view was, of course, deceptive. The mass of the German public might have continued to hope for peace. It had, however, voted for Adolf Hitler, a naked militarist and racist, in sufficient numbers to make the Nazi Party the largest in the country, and its leader, on the 30th of January 1933, Chancellor. Once in power, while throwing hundreds of thousands of dissidents and political opponents into concentration camps and beginning a consistent policy of pogroms and discrimination against German Jews, the obnoxious but to many of his people spellbinding Austrian-born adventurer had appeared to miraculously solve the problem of high unemployment. Hitler's program of rearmament and national self-assertion, while still proclaiming peaceful intent, a trick perhaps learned from Soviet propaganda, gained him further popularity and served to mask the regime's contradictions. True, German industrial workers were distinctly less well off than their equivalents in Britain, France, and certainly the USA, and were forced to work even harder. A compulsory 60-hour week was introduced in early 1939. However, at least they had jobs, as their government constantly reminded them. There were compensations for loyalty in the form of the party's Strength Through Joy, Pleasure and Leisure organization, and a wide range of government-supported training and further education courses for the ambitious worker. Of course, for those bold enough to suggest that all this was still not quite enough, there was always the threat of the Gestapo, the Geheime Staatspolizei, to enforce acquiescence. Almost 6 years after Hitler had seized power, he seemed more popular than ever. The fact nonetheless remained that Germany, though outwardly strong and prosperous, was storing up problems. Falls in foreign currency reserves and raw materials shortages threatened to bankrupt the country. So long as the economy remained Nazified, and therefore in normal economic terms unsustainable, these problems could only be solved by acquiring new territory and resources, with or without war. By contrast, Britain in the late 1930s, although gradually losing its grip on empire and suffering from setbacks to its traditional mining and heavy industrial sectors, was on the whole in good shape economically. The decision to abandon the gold standard in 1931 had permitted a more flexible economy than in other advanced countries, and thus a speedier recovery. High unemployment in the still depressed north of the country, leading to desperate popular protests such as the Jarrow March, contrasted with rising living standards in the English South and Midlands, where modern consumer-directed manufacturing, including motor vehicle production, electrical equipment, radio communications, and latterly aircraft production, and new service industries brought unheard-of prosperity. Owing to cheap credit, the 1930s was also an era of enormous expansion in house building, leading to a booming construction sector. From 1936, and with reluctance, after it grew clear that Germany was rearming, the British government paid reluctant heed to expanding its armed forces. Local city and town officials were primed with providing a basic civil defense infrastructure, for it was clear that a new war would involve devastating aerial bombardment. However, many, especially those controlled by the broadly anti-war Labour Party, dragged their feet in imposing what was described as militarization of everyday life. The great majority of the British population did not favour war. Britain was no longer the almost limitlessly wealthy superpower it had been before 1914. The country's continuing world power status now relied on the maintenance of a rules-based international order with its guarantees of the global status quo, and especially of Britain's precious empire. A world war would make British power vulnerable to Germany, and to Germany's allies, Italy in the Mediterranean and the Middle East, and Japan in the Far East. This prompted much of the reasoning behind Neville Chamberlain's so-called policy of appeasement. In Germany, whatever the private feelings of some citizens, which they were usually wise enough to keep to themselves, there was not much obvious opposition to rapid remilitarization, or the building of air raid shelters and imposition of rigorous air raid drills. All these began to be implemented almost immediately after the Nazi seizure of power. There was little active desire for war, but unlike the case in Britain, little or no opposition to restoring the ability to wage it. especially as rearmament created much-needed jobs. In short, what many Germans wanted was the fruits of war without the need for actual conflict, which does not quite equate to wanting peace. The contradiction...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?